Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Let's Combinate. Today we have a guest who's been on the show before. Welcome back, Skip, a global leader in program management, constraint management, and design for Six Sigma. With decades of experience in product development, Skip has helped many Fortune 500 companies optimize design processes, reduce risk, and drive innovation in highly regulated industries like medical device, pharma, and aerospace. I got introduced to Skip via a colleague of mine that I had done a course under for concurrent costing and design for assembly and design for manufacturability. And that person is just like, as if you just imagine an engineer and that's that person. And I was just asking him about certain things with medical devices and pharma and the application of some of this stuff. And he was like, you know who you should talk to? You should talk to Skip because he started out general industry and then moved into medical devices, pharma, and has been able to apply a lot of the tools there. Welcome, Skip.
Thank you.
You did I don't know if transition is the right word, but you started exclusively in manufacturing.
Eastman Kodak was the
Eastman
beginning of it.
Kodak.
I spent just about 20 years as an R&D engineer there. I did do some time in production because when you start in tech dev and go through product development, you get sent to production for a couple of years to fix everything that slipped through and that was my touch point with production, living with what you develop.
I saw this in one company in medical device where the development team transitioned to the on-market support team. I haven't seen that in pharma companies, but I did definitely see it on one pretty complicated, say, medical device. But what drove you to the shift in industries?
Kodak had professional and consumer business lines. So you could think of them as a big diversified company doing materials development and manufacturing, which you'd remember film and
Right.
photographic papers as the core. And then they began to expand out from that into Kodak, an imaging company, expanded into cameras, of course, in the early days. And then we went into copiers, printers, scanners, and anything associated with digital and consumer image development and production for utilization. So that was what characterized Eastman Kodak. And of course, they're legendary for fumbling the digital transformation. And I was there for it. I was in the copier printer division, which did successfully do digital transformation with complex optomechatronic systems using the technology of Xerox electrophotographic, very complicated stuff. And as simple as one-time use cameras, which were plastic injection molded, reusable cameras that harness 35 millimeter film to harvest profits from that dying technology replaced by what we now have in our cell phones.
As you made that transition from consumer products or imaging to medical devices, you remained technical, but you started focusing more on program management. What drove that shift?
That issue and area of interest was born at Eastman Kodak because we had program managers, and subordinate to them, we had project managers. Kodak's a very big company at the time, and so we had a wide variety of methods and techniques for program project management, and variability was a problem. And so we as development engineers would be working under the guidance of project managers and chief engineers, and they drove us nuts. Every program was different. Every management style was different. I became aware of the product management body of knowledge in graduate school, where I learned a standardized approach to building interwoven portfolios of projects to be managed. It became very obvious that project management was chaotic in many cases, managed by people who weren't educated in PMBOK, project management body of knowledge. And so you had soup to nuts in terms of variability, and therefore the quality of the execution of the projects also had wide variability, and it damaged the company's ability to grow as a worker bee, as a development engineer and a design engineer, and then going into production support engineering. And you just saw the consequences of poor execution of program and project management. And the thing that started to stand out was there's a process to this. There's a pedagogy, trainable. It's able to be centralized in divisions and then across corporate structures so that there's a core competence inside of a corporation of excellence in program and project management.
You mentioned the PM. In pharma and medical devices, there's a lot of expectations around product development that structures the development processes. Like on the drug side, many companies in medical devices, device design controls or product realization, as it's called in ISO language, is what ends up driving a lot of the process. And many requirements are compliance focused. Have you seen any systems that helped bridge the gap between compliant processes, but also efficient processes that actually yield good product?
I've been in a number of medical device companies and also used Becton Dickinson as a case. There was a desire to use a formalized product development process, PDP, with phases and gates to manage risk, to make decision points at key areas where you finished enough work to assess enough risk to say, yep, we're good to go, keep going. Those points of decision making we called gates. Some people think phases and gates are ridiculous, and other people think they're absolutely best practices. I happen to be one who thinks they're best practices. So
What's the case against?
leaders who have very strong opinions that become hubris. They wish a thing to be true, they become believers in their wishes and hopes and drive towards that without any rational or logical basis in process, rigor, and discipline. So they
Could you give me like an example? Because you're saying that people who would be against a process that has phases or gates don't want artificial constraints applied to whatever they want to do. So
they
if
may
you're
see it as
because a lot of
artificial. Go ahead.
because a lot of gating processes I've seen are tied to access to capital until you exit. It's like
Yeah.
probability of technical and regulatory success percentages until you've done the following. It ends up being an expanded proof of concept process where in the
Sure.
first phase, you've proved out 10%, and in the second phase, 20%. And as you move on, you're like, okay, this concept is a reality now. It's validatable based on what the user needs are and so on. Just for context for people who aren't involved in product development as much.
There is an approach called build, test, fix.
Okay, so it's kind of like
Right.
ready, fire, aim. So it's ready, fire, aim
Yep.
versus deliberate, disciplined product development.
You
Makes a
get it
lot of
up
sense.
fast and watch it blow. We just had it yesterday. Another rocket shot up, blows up, rains down, disrupts air traffic. This is a strategy. It's not a good one. It has worked, and it goes like this: go fast, take risk, break things, learn from it, fix it, and try again. That works, but it takes a long time and it's expensive. My view is hope is not a plan, but planning gives us hope. People who think carefully through tasks, work breakdown structure to a project manager. What am I going to do? Enable it to be done right the first time, prevent problems, have contingency plans, and corrective reaction. Sometimes we do have to react. We'd like to keep that at a minimum. And so a good model to follow isn't build, test, fix. It's more like the old Deming model of plan, do, check, act. Leap when you're ready to leap. And I'll give you another example. Well, BD was really heavily involved in having a world class, high level phase gate process to manage consistently all the projects across the whole company and all the diversity that Becton Dickinson has. And it's very diverse. And so they wanted all projects run underneath the umbrella of their PDP, their global product development system. That gave a marching order to everybody in the company that this is how we work to be consistent across all our divisions so that we're very predictable and have trust. Wall Street and investors love this. But if project managers and program managers show up and they wing it and they just don't go to a, let's say, a project work breakdown structure with PERT and Gantt charts and the rigor that goes into that. They make it up on a daily basis. And the structure that holds that all together is endless amounts of meetings. Meetings become a surrogate for process discipline. So if you go into a company and everybody's spending tons of times making stuff up every day in meetings and then saying, hike, let's go run the play, that's a very common outcome from people like that aren't process disciplined, that don't have rigor and discipline in putting together a plan, thinking before they act. It's a real problem. Another example was Illumina, the gene sequencing company in La Jolla. It started with a rational approach to research and development: go fast, learn quick, recover, react, and take risks. They had to stop doing that when they went through clinical transformation, when they stopped just serving the research unit only market and went into clinics and doctors' offices with ever smaller, more capable gene sequencers. When I met with their CEO, my advice was slow down to go fast. He looked at me like I had three heads. And I showed him what that meant. The antidote was shifting from build, test, fix to critical parameter management, the best practice under Design for Six Sigma. It's probably the best thing that ever came out of Design for Six Sigma, besides the front end work on voice of the customer and proper requirements definition. But so the mantra of slow down to go fast really is a call to plan, get yourself a good project management structure, and live by data. Don't get your timelines out ahead of your data, where you're making decisions in the absence of data yet to be analyzed and used for good decision making and risk management. It's a very tidy, orderly approach, and disorganized people with hubris, people who don't know what they're doing in enterprise management, make mistakes every day, which slows things down, drives costs through the roof, causes recalls. There's a thing called a consent decree that puts the brakes on big time. Just take lightly the rigors and discipline of phase gate processes for development, wave off project-based rigor, and don't think about tools, methods, and best practices. Just hire people and tell them, you got a degree from a school we like, go make good things happen. That the universities don't educate people to work in phase gate processes and under project management. They teach engineers about physics, science, and math. Maybe you'll get a primer in some electives if you choose them, where project management might be an elective in a graduate course or a senior elective. But it's just people not having the discipline and patience to follow a rational process with rigor and discipline.
The counter to that is you can attain success that way. You're saying it's inefficient and undisciplined. To play devil's advocate, ready, fire, aim has the advantage of just like, let's not overthink it. We can maybe have a high level schedule. We can maybe have defined actions. We don't need to go through the A to Z before. I think in an ideal world, you'd have a middle ground where the ability to move fast and break things is also constrained by where does that fit in within our process. In medical devices, when you tie phase gates to product development, you incentivize trying to meet artificial milestones because it ends up being self-accountability. So you may end up having a milestone for concept phase exit, let's say, and you rush because it's undefined. It's not like, say, testing that has to follow the V model where you have acceptance criteria and validated methods and so on and so forth. And so I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I think what ends up happening is perception of discipline sometimes, and it ends up handcuffing you because you're saying, look, I did everything to get out of concept, but
Yep.
it's not everything that you should have. You should have maybe spent 2 years in concept and 1 year in development versus 6 months in concept, 5 years in development.
That's what happens.
What I've seen in one case was an elaborate phased process, but no discipline.
So this is where we get to sizing and scoping project architectures. And so let's set that stage by saying we have simple, relatively fast projects that have a little bit of innovation, a little bit of new technology, and a lot of reuse in them. This is where we get into the area of ecos, easy, common, old requirements we can act quickly on. You may have a great product. I saw this at 3M. They had a great product in the States and they wanted to just redesign it a bit to meet other international markets. That was what I would call a fast track project where you can go fast because the design changes, low risk. There might be a handful we call new, unique to our business, or difficult technologically. NUDs, we call them new, unique, and difficult. And maybe you'll have 10% of the product NUDs and 90% of the product ecos. My advice, go fast. You can take some liberties with that kind of small, quick project. Now let's shift gears to a medium sized project where you have more NUDs, less ecos, and you're trying to be a little bit more prudent in how fast you go because there's higher risk because you might be up in the 20% NUD, 80% eco area. What you can look at is contingent planning, a baseline of where in the NUD scheme of requirements should we be preventative? Where in the hybrid NUDs and ecos do we make every attempt to have contingency plans where we have leading indicators and trigger points that tell us to slow down? A good balance for a project is preventive planning, some contingent planning, and corrective reaction, things that aren't going well. We better have contingency plans in place that can keep us moving forward quickly or as quick as is logical. Then we shift to a big project. And I'm talking about a Dreamliner jet aircraft or a large clinical diagnostic system for looking at disease states where you have a lot of system integration and complexity. You need more focus on preventative action in your project plan, more contingent actions, plan B, C, D, with trigger points and leading indicators to warn you that we're not going to make it. Low emphasis on corrective action. Recipes that work. The core competence a company should develop is templates, project templates for quick projects, medium, controlled projects, more disciplined, and project work breakdown templates for big projects that carry a lot of NUDs, a lot of newness, new technologies, breakthroughs that nobody knows you're working on. Then you need formal systems engineering, formal project management, rigorously defined deliverables for gate reviews, and a clear entry criteria for the next phase. Are we ready to do this work? If we're not, then we better get ourselves in shape to conduct the next phase's work in these very complex, large, high risk projects. I've worked on all three of those in all kinds of different ways, but having the discussions in your program management office to build templates for fast, medium, and big projects, that's a big deal. And to have thought through size, scaled, and scope those templates, those are what your project managers come and open up, and then they adjust them. They modify them to fit the specific projects that are coming out of your portfolio renewal process, where you've ranked and prioritized goals with their embryonic business cases, your staffing, and resource allocations, and you have a cutoff. You say, I can do these 10 projects, and that's it, no more. Companies, they know we're doing 15, and if you won't do them, I'll find somebody who will. And then they overload everybody and they make morale go down and people feel overworked and underappreciated. The good ones leave and those who can't stay and bang their head against the wall.
You talked about templates,
Yep.
and when it comes to program planning in medical devices and pharma, the timelines are more expanded than consumer goods. You may be looking at a 5-year, 10-year timeline at the outset, since we're talking about phase gates. To what extent is planning for the end in mind important? If you're going to plan a 10-year project, it's one, going to take forever, but two, your plans are going to be based on well established understanding. It's like you may say, for example, we're going to put supplier and CMO selection 6 months, but
Mhm.
as that can actually take 2 years.
Yep.
Sometimes getting a definitive agreement with a contractor can take forever, regardless of what you put in a timeline. There are things that are big movers. It's one thing if you plan for testing to take a month and it takes 35 days. It's another thing to say, I have contracts that take 6 months and contracts that take 2 years to get signed.
Right.
Do you typically plan out an entire project from concept to launch at the outset? And how
Absolutely.
sophisticated? Yes. So walk me through how you deal with the ambiguity around some, say, really big items, because there are some things that are out of our control. You can control your internal resources or contractors with external allocation. You can control that. But there are some things that would be unforeseen, let's say, and could lead to significant delays. How do you bake that into a schedule typically?
Okay, there are a couple of things. The first and foremost is you lay out your schedule as a project manager and you sit down with all of the key players in marketing, technical engineering, supply chain, quality, all of that. And you rationalize the preliminary adaptable schedule from the template and make sure everybody has buy in. Then you ask a simple question. You bring in a little triangular shape. And at one end of it, it says longest likely time it's to take if everything goes poorly. At the peak is the likeliest time if everything goes to plan. And the other end is the best case scenario. Everything goes great, right? Which never happens. Maybe on the ecos it does, but not the nuds. So you have a best case, worst case, and likeliest case. You run a Monte Carlo simulation on your laptop, on your project plan, and look at what if scenarios. It doesn't take long to do, dozens, if not many more. And you can run 5,000, 10,000 simulations at a crack on a project schedule. The Monte Carlo randomly samples from these triangular distributions and it builds you a grand distribution. Usually they mimic a normal distribution for the most part that tells you when you're likely to be done. You run stress cases on your plan according to proper rationalization of these work breakdown structures in these templates. And you bring in, hopefully from experience and having been in business for years, how long things take to do. I taught thousands of engineers and scientists how to do designed experiments. Project managers came in and said, I have no idea what that is. How long do they take? We had to show them functionally what a designed experiment is versus build, test, fix, trial and error tests. If you want to run a test and see how you did, then clean up the mess afterwards, that's a way. If you want to run statistically designed experiments, which most medical device companies do, you've got to build a knowledge base. Some take days, some take weeks to run properly designed experiments. It's a best practice. And it is one of the greatest enablers in technology development and product development that we as engineers have, especially if we're working on science and technology that is brand new and no one knows all of its secrets yet. Those are nuts, that they're difficult. And we learn about difficult parameter relationships through designed experiments, not tests. Tests are at the end, right? You can run statistical t-tests and things like that. They're wonderful, but you better do your designed experiments up front to know and understand on a very detailed basis, parametrically, what makes this thing work.
We
And
talked
then you go to robustness, right, for stress tests.
we
Go
we t-
ahead.
we talked in the past about constraint management. We did a whole episode on it and the ecos versus the nuds thing. Are those technical requirements that fit into something like a product requirement document, PRD or PRS,
Yes,
some people call it? Or is or do you expand NUD to include something like we need to find a contract manufacturer to make this new kind of product that doesn't exist?
of
So
course.
I do think there are some things that, let's say, I worked on a program where sterility was the biggest constraint because it involved sterilizing a primary container inside of a sort of a secondary container, but you wanted to be able to sterilize one within the other and close it. And so, anyways, there was a lot of moving pieces, let's say, as
Yep,
far as sterilization goes. So that would for sure be NUD.
yep,
Another thing that was very difficult was how do we find a company willing to assemble this thing?
yep.
When managing your schedule, do you consider those things as NUDs?
A project manager would do a project FMEA, failure modes and effects analysis, on tasks in their schedule. And those could be functional engineering tasks that go right to the physics and statistics of how a function works inside a gene sequencer, as an example. That would be the engineer's concern. A manufacturing and supply chain engineer who has responsibility for partnering with outside companies for parts that they may be designing and manufacturing and integrating with you into subassemblies or subsystems, then the project manager would see high risk failure modes potentially emerging in supply chain relationships and tasks. So it's specific, whether it's a human process or a physics based process inside a machinery.
A project FMEA is something a project manager would do in medical device risk management, design FMEAs, process FMEAs, use FMEAs, application FMEAs, software FMEAs. Those things are common and bread and butter stuff. I've never heard of a project FMEA.
Right. I understand that. And there's even a more important one called a portfolio FMEA. Up front, when you're designing what's our product portfolio architecture going to look like, what projects are we going to do, and how can they go poorly for us? That's a portfolio activation, failure modes, and effects analysis. Let's say your portfolio has 10 new projects. We call that portfolio renewal. And so each member of that portfolio team will participate. Usually there's a half a dozen, 8 people on a portfolio team, both marketing and technical and supply chain people, a cross functional portfolio team. They're going to do an FMEA on their list of projects that made the cut. What can go wrong with these 10 projects, and what can we do to be preventative of that as we allocate funds and resources to go execute these things? And they have to have contingency plans too. What if a project dies on the vine? What are we going to replace it with? And how quickly do we kill? When I did DFSS at 3M, one of the first things they did at the senior level was go from green, yellow, red assessments of projects to a fourth color, black, which was we don't kill anything. And we're going to start using DFSS rigor and critical parameter management to kill stuff early when we see warning signs. That's contingency planning, right? We have a trigger point at which we kill it and it goes black. And politically, that's the way it's going to work here. We have green, yellow, red, and black. And boy, did that clarify things. And it kept the project portfolio clean of wasteful projects that were pet projects of some senior level person, typically a marketer. And that was Jim McNerney's way of saying, nope, we're going to trim the hedge and keep investing. When we see a kill point, that's what we're going to do. And they
Yeah,
did.
and I've been on one project before where it felt like, okay, we're just doing this for the sake of doing it. Like it has very low probability of actually working out. And that ends up showing up in the morale because you don't believe that it's actually going to work out. I've seen with
Yeah.
some of the design engineers. Skip, where can people find you?
People can find me on my email address, which is real simple, skipcreveling@yahoo.com. That's how you get a hold of me. I work when people need help and know what they're looking for in terms of what I do, then I come out of retirement and put the drumsticks down and pick up my old professional mantle as trainer and consultant. I still work when people know what they want. They want critical parametrics and problem prevention with contingent planning and the modern forms of derivations of both technology and design for Six Sigma, even research excellence. If people are doing research projects, those are basic and applied research projects following the scientific method at the rarefied atmosphere of pure research. Then I have a approach for that as well.
Thanks for coming on, Skip. This was great.
Yeah. Thanks